Suppose the Brexit vote had gone 52-48 the other way. Now, you wouldn't have had the immediate fall in the pound and so on, but I'm pretty sure, have had at least another 6 years of political chaos afterwards, because I don't think the Brexiteers would have said, OK, that's fine, let's get on with government as normal.
Monzo Business is the proud partner of The Rest is Money. Now, did you know that over 600,000 businesses are already banking with Monzo Business? And mine is one of them. To celebrate us teaming up, we've got a special offer for you. New customers get Monzo Business Pro or Team for free for the first 6 months. Just head to monzo.com/therestismoney to claim it for your business. Now, maybe you run your own company and you're looking for a bank with the solutions to make your financial admin easier, like expense cards that help your team save loads of time as your business grows. Just go to monzo.com/therestismoney to learn more about the special offer and find out which of their plans is right for you. Offer is available to new Monzo Business customers only for either Pro or Team plan. Offer ends on the 31st of July 2025. After the offer period ends, Pro will be £9 a month and Team from £25 a month. Expense cards are only available with Team. Only sole traders or limited company directors in the UK can apply. T's and C's apply.
Hello and welcome to The Rest is Money with me, Robert Peston.
And me, Steph McGovern, and back with us for a second episode in this little mini-series with Paul Johnson from the IFS. Outgoing, he's now left the IFS as this episode's going out. But yeah, we want to look back, don't we, Robert, at his time being in charge of the Institute for Fiscal Studies since 2011. He worked there before that as well, but took over in 2011. So loads to ask him about what it's been like in his time.
He has, and I think what we really want to do is get two kinds of assessments from him. One, why have the public finances deteriorated so much? It was his job to keep an eye on them in 2011. Why has the national debt exploded? Did any government since 2011 get anything right? So that's one big question. And secondly, given that he is the critic of all these chancellors, and my goodness, he's had to work with a ton of them, what would he do if he was chancellor? How would he reform the tax system? What kind of fiscal rules would he want? So here is our second part of our interview with the outgoing head of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson.
Paul, it's lovely to have you back. And, after such a long time at the IFS, you've been there, since 2011? How are you feeling about leaving?
Yeah, it's not just I've been there since 2011. I actually did the first 10 years of my working life at the IFS back in the 80s and 90s. So it's been a really important part of my life. And I've absolutely loved being at the IFS. It's a wonderful institution. My colleagues are just extraordinary. So it's a huge wrench. It really is. To be honest, partly I'm leaving because I think it's the right thing for an organisation not to have someone running it for too long. My colleague Helen Miller, who's taking over, is just fantastic. So I know that I'm leaving it in really good hands. But for me, it was finally time for a change. So it's really tough to leave. But I guess I think it was the right thing to do. At least I hope I still think that in a year's time.
Did running the IFS feel like quite a heavy responsibility? The reason I ask is just because one of the really unusual things about the Institute for Fiscal Studies is the extent to which what you would say in the aftermath of a budget or a spending review really mattered. Newspapers would write lead stories on the basis of whether you were being critical or not critical of a budget. News organisations, TV stations like ITV, where I work, and the BBC would also, they'd lead the news on the pronouncements of the IFS. So if you got it wrong, that was quite serious. Was there quite a lot of pressure associated with running it?
Yes, but let me start by saying that there's two different sorts of pressure. One is that I think people don't understand that the IFS we are just literally a small charity that exists by happenstance. So part of
which is why it's extraordinary that you have this influence.
And so one of the pressures is just making sure that we're still here next year. Literally, all of our work is funded by raising research grants, and again by my amazing colleagues who do a fantastic job of doing that. So there's that responsibility of running the organisation, at least feeling responsible for it in that sense. But then the question you're getting at is the external impact. And that's something it took quite some time, I think, to get used to or appreciate. I think one finds it difficult to realise that one can have that impact, that what we say can be so important. But once you do get your head around that, then yes, it is a significant responsibility. But again, I think the way that we work collectively, where we are very careful to get the facts right, we're very careful about the way that we speak, so that we're not chasing headlines with what we say. We're
do you
trying to
train
say
your colleagues to be measured in how they express stuff?
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the fantastic things about the IFS. I mean, we hire people straight out of university at 21 or 22. We train them in economics, probably the best place in the country where you can be trained as a really good economist. But also, they get a lot of practice in speaking to the media and presenting and so on, so that by the time they're in their late 20s, they are polished performers. And some of my colleagues are fantastic at that.
Do you have to say to them, like, okay, right, that you delivered that beautifully, but you were a bit too excited, or it sounded a bit dramatic? Like when you say, to get the measure right, because I remember watching Mark Carney when it was the morning of Brexit, and there was him having to do this speech to kind of make sure the markets didn't take too much from how he said what he said, like getting the tone right. So is that part of it then? Just like how you deliver the tone of things, you're saying?
To some extent, it's the whole culture of the place. The whole culture of the place is to be independent and objective and careful and to communicate effectively. We do it explicitly. So whenever, you see the presentations that my colleagues give after a budget, even by 10 o'clock the next morning, they will have practiced that a couple of times with someone else, so that we've kind of fed back to them and they know that. And
you work all through the night after a budget, don't you?
Pretty much. And that's just one example. I mean, obviously most of what we do, I mean, the budgets are only once or twice a year. Most of what we do is longer term, more serious research, but we then present that in a way that we hope helps policymakers, the media, public understand what's there. So again, the way we present it is important, as well as the quality of the work that we do. And I say that is the whole culture of the place and why it works, in my view, so well.
Can I just ask on this issue of getting it right? If you look back on the sort of 14 years you've been there, is there any evaluation that you made of a fiscal event, a budget or a spending review, or something else, where if you'd had your time again, you might have had a different take?
Oh gosh, I'm sure there is, but they all sort of merge into one after all of this time, which is maybe why it's time for me to move on. I mean, it's there were times through COVID, for example, where we found it very difficult to make a judgment about what we should say about some of the policies that were implemented then, both because of the complexities around COVID itself, but also was the generosity of the furlough scheme and how long it went on appropriate. And I think maybe we self-censored a bit too much during that period.
Well, because you just didn't want to cause more anxiety for a nation that was already very anxious.
And because we weren't sure, to be honest. So,
what do you think now? Because, I mean, there is a fair amount of evidence, certainly on the debt side, that, frankly, the borrowing was too much.
Well, I think we were too generous. I mean, I think one thing that is very clear is that furlough went on for too long. And I can't remember how clearly we said that at the time. Probably not very clearly. But I think I remember thinking it and thinking, is that something that is, are we sure enough about that? So I think that's one example where, maybe we, occasionally too careful.
That's so tricky, though, because hindsight is obviously a great thing, but at the time, we didn't know when it was going to end. When it started, It was just like, it might be just a couple of weeks of us having a lockdown or whatever. So it'd be very hard to have made that decision to stop furlough at the time any sooner, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, remember it ended in September 2021, and that was quite a long time after the last lockdown had occurred. Yeah. And obviously the vaccine was being rolled out. And the extraordinary thing ex post was that lots of people worrying, I think there was still about 1 1.5 million people on furlough, something like that. I mean, this is from deep memory at the end of September 2021. And everyone was worried, well, once furlough goes, there'll be a huge spike in unemployment. And there was nothing at all.
Which broadly told you that it had gone on too long.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there were lots of indications that that was the case beforehand. That and I also think, and there's a different issue, that probably the Bank of England got things wrong during COVID with the scale of its money printing operations over that period as well. So I think there were, things there where at the time, that looks a bit iffy, but it was a moment of national crisis. So it's quite hard to know what the right response is.
Can I take you back to 2011? You join right in the thick of the George Osborne, David Cameron austerity programme. Was the IFS concerned enough, publicly critical enough of the fact that they were doing damage to the growth rate by the way that they were reducing investment?
So I think you're right, there were big cuts in investment there. And I think that was always a problem. I can't remember to the extent to which we referred to that as an issue. I think there were always two competing sort of thoughts in our minds during that period. One was this was an historically extraordinary set of cuts to public service spending, which we, talked about a lot. And the other was, there is a big problem here with the level of borrowing and debt that we've got, and the fact the economy has got a lot smaller than we expected to be, and therefore something's got to give. We were very clear that there was a choice here between spending and tax. The government went on the spending side. So if you look back, what looks to have happened is that I think you can make a pretty strong case that, the first 3 years, say, of those spending cuts were, in a sense, fine. I'm not talking about the investment spending at this point. Local government and various other bits of the public sector coped. But then the next sort of after 2013, things started to really start to go wrong. And I think that's where it was really doing damage that we're still seeing in the justice system, in social care and so on. And you didn't get that level of focus in central government on, it went well for 2 or 3 years, so we can do more of it, I think was the kind of view.
Let's just look at health in particular. Although health increased fractionally in real terms relative to the demands on health and relative to the real increases that health had seen since the creation of the NHS, this was really hard for hospitals and GPs and the health service in general. Now, looking at the big sums of money that are going in to health, weirdly, if austerity had been less biting on health, would we also be, net of everything, spending less in the round now?
I think that's a really interesting question. And if you look at sort of the health service over the last 25 years, you saw astonishingly fast increases in spending over the 2000s. And there's some evidence that wasn't all well used because it was coming in so fast that it sort of
was driving up costs. Exactly. It was causing inflation.
Exactly. So it was driving up costs in the service at the time and creating, I think, some inefficiencies. And indeed, if you look at productivity in the health service, it looked terrible over that period. And then you have the 2010s when the taps are turned off. Actually, you do see productivity increasing over that period, but they're sort of forced to do more with, not with less, but with no more coming in. And again, I think, some slowdown in the rate of growth was probably not a bad thing in terms of consolidating. But then again, things through 2015 and after started to get really tough again. And we've got this huge increases in waiting lists, which preceded COVID and actually not even now seem to be driven by COVID. Certainly a much more rational thing would have been over this 25 years to have had a similar average rate of increase, but to do it, much more smoothly rather than the feast and famine that we've seen.
Are there any examples anywhere in the world where austerity has worked, where it has, got people in the end have got back on track?
So it depends what you mean by work. I mean, in Ireland, for example, had a much, much stronger, deeper, but shorter period of austerity to get itself back on track. And
so did Greece.
And Greece the same. And they really have got themselves back on track in a really impressive way. And it may well be that a shorter, sharper dose would have been more effective rather than the sort of long-term boiling, as it were.
It is a fascinating issue whether or not as you say, long drawn out boiling of the frog, sort of meanness over a period of many, many years is more pernicious than a radical cut.
Yeah. Lots of countries had austerity in the sense of raising taxes and cutting spending to get borrowing under control. Where the UK was different from a lot of those countries, particularly in Europe, is we did more on the spending side and less on the tax side over that period. And we're sort of reaping the rewards of that at the moment, where we're finding we're having to increase spending and taxes to undo some of those effects. What did austerity achieve in terms of, getting the size of the state down? By 2019, the size of the state was almost exactly the same as it had been in 2008 after 10 years of new Labour government, which had significantly increased spending over that period. So what austerity did was get us back to where we'd been in 2008. It wasn't to shrink the state to where it had been in 1997 or some previous moment. And that's because there were continued pressures on health spending being the obvious one, but other parts of the welfare state as well. And again, when growth is really poor, you've just got less scope for making public services better without increasing the size of the state.
But broadly, because people need to understand this, it wasn't, let's be clear, that austerity was somehow more generous than is widely thought. It is simply that when you have an economy that is not growing, the problem you end up is a proportion of a relatively smaller economy. As you say, the state, public services are as a proportion bigger, but in absolute terms, there's obviously been a lot of downward pressure.
Yeah, so if you look at spending on things like the justice system, local government and so on, by 2019 they were well down on where they'd been in 2010 in real terms. But because spending on other things like health and so on had gone up, the overall effect was relative to the size of the economy. You were the same place in 2019 as you were in 2008.
But part of the problem here is just that we hadn't had a growing economy.
Exactly. So had the economy grown as we would have expected from 2008 onwards, then we'd have had piles more money to invest in these
piles
things.
more money, or as a share of GDP, the state would have been a lot smaller.
Possibly that's what would have happened. I mean, most of history tells us we would have probably just maintained the size of the state and had a better health service.
This is just a thought experiment. That's all. It's not that in practice, governments wouldn't have spent more if there hadn't been more tax revenue. It is more that the reason why austerity doesn't take us back to a sort of Thatcherite world is because there's no growth.
Absolutely.
As you'd expect, Paul, I've got tons more questions to put to you, as does Steph. So stay where you are. We'll be back in a minute or two.
So the last time we spoke to you, Paul, in the previous episode, you talked about how, we were talking about fiscal rules at the time. And if you look at the last kind of 25 years of them coming in, our debt deficit has risen faster than other countries. We're paying more interest on government debt than other OECD countries, apart from, I think you mentioned Iceland. So it's disappointing, isn't it? Have we got anything right in that time? Because it feels like we've just had austerity. We've had various different, governments now as well. I know they haven't been in long, but, we've had a change of government. Things don't feel like they've got any better. It must be disappointing for you when you've been talking about, fiscal stuff for the last over a decade and we haven't improved in any way.
I mean, I think it genuinely is much too early to judge this government. I mean, we've only had a year and it takes a long time to make a difference. If you look at the period since 2010, you've got one period, which is the period up to 2016, where you've got, whatever you think of it, a government which had a sort of a strategy, and that strategy was to cut spending and get borrowing under control. And you could see what they were trying to achieve. And they got re-elected in 2015 with a very clear manifesto saying we're going to keep cutting spending. And actually, if you look at the sort of earnings figures and so on, they're just beginning to turn around in 2015, early 2016.
They are. And then they make this catastrophic strategic error of having a referendum on leaving the EU. And at just the point when the economy is taking off, we vote to leave the EU and everything collapses.
Exactly. So you have the immediate sort of negative effect there. And then if you're kind of dividing this period up, you've got the period from 2016 really pretty much through to the last election. I mean, you could argue that a year or two before that of complete political chaos. Now, I think one of the questions in terms of what the impact of Brexit is you've got the impact on politics, which has the consequence that nothing else happens, that you don't get the reforms to local government finance, you don't get the focus on social care, you don't get the changes that reforms you might need in the health service, or indeed any kind of comprehensible tax policy, because everyone's focused on this sort of getting out of the EU and the chaotic politics. But I think it's worth doing a thought experiment. Suppose the Brexit vote had gone 52-48 the other way. Now, you wouldn't have had the immediate fall in the pound and so on, but I'm pretty sure, have had at least another 6 years of political chaos afterwards, because I don't think the Brexiteers would have said, OK, that's fine, let's get on with government as normal. I think we would have had a different form of chaos and therefore some of the negative consequences of that. But so we've had a really extraordinary period since 2016 where fiscal policy has essentially taken a very much a back seat until much more recently, as everybody's been focused on this whole issue of how you deal with Brexit. And the combination of the real economic effect, as it were, and the political effect has been to make sure that we've performed fairly poorly over that period.
That's interesting that you're saying the problem was the question being asked in the first place, not the actual result of the question, because either way, chaos ensued.
Well, I mean, who knows what would have happened if it had gone 52-48 the other way? But my guess is, as I say, we wouldn't have just got back to business as normal.
Now, I'm going to put, I don't know whether you're going to regard these as fair or unfair questions, but some
I'm guessing unfair, given that you've prefaced them with that question.
You've had all these years holding chancellors to account, often causing them enormous difficulties. So I'm going to ask you two big questions. Given that you're the know-it-all on all this stuff, tell us what your ideal tax system would be.
God, how long have you got?
And tell us what your ideal set of fiscal rules would be.
Wow.
An ideal tax system. Well, that really is. Look, you're going to have to invite me back for another 6 episodes to go through.
Give us the framework.
To go through that. I mean, the framework is that it's really important that tax systems treat similar things similarly. And our tax system fails on that in all sorts of ways. It treats different sorts of income differently. So if you're self-employed or a business owner or an employee, you get taxed really quite differently.
You're saying that has really negative distorting effects.
That has negative effects on the way that people behave. We tax cakes and biscuits differently. We tax different kinds of consumption differently, and that has a negative effect. We're pretty much the only country that doesn't have any VAT on food, for example. You see, I would never get re-elected if I was introducing my ideal tax system, which is part of the problem. We've got this absurd sort of difference between national insurance contributions and income tax. National insurance is just another tax on earnings. We undertax, therefore, pension income because there's no national insurance contributions on that, whereas there is on earned income.
And is there any rationale for having this ceiling on national insurance?
If you didn't have that ceiling on national insurance, you'd have another, another 6% on top of other taxes. So the top rate tax wouldn't be 47%, it would be 53%. And you'd have to, then consider whether that was appropriate in that way. Because again, you need to look at this together. We still have a progressive system overall if you add income tax and national insurance. There's a real problem in Scotland, by the way, where the higher rate of tax comes in well below the national insurance ceiling. So if you're between something like, I can't remember, 45 and 50,000 in Scotland, you're paying a really high rate of tax on that income. But the one bit of taxation that I would target immediately for change is the taxation of housing, which is an absolute catastrophe. We talked a bit about council tax in the last episode. It's absurd, it's regressive, it's out of date, it's distortionary. But what makes me even angrier is stamp duty, which is, I think, probably the worst tax that we have. And chancellors keep on increasing it.
And remind us why it's the worst tax?
It's a tax on transactions, and that means that one of the consequences of all these increases in stamp duty is that the number of transactions in the housing market is much lower than it was 30 years ago, and much lower than it otherwise would have been. It locks people into houses that are inappropriate for them. So, big family houses don't get sold and people don't trade down. At least one part of the reason for that, it's not the only reason, of course, is that there's a huge cost to be paid when you do that. If I want to swap my house with my next door neighbour because their house is more appropriate for me, we have to pay the government a huge amount of money for the privilege. And unbelievably, in the last October's budget, Rachel Reeves increased stamp duty on second properties. Now, you might think, well, I mean, who cares about people who own second properties? But these are often rental properties, and who's going to pay the cost of that? Well, it's renters. And if there's one thing that we really don't want to be doing, it's to be further increasing the costs of people in rented accommodation, which is one of the things which is a real problem nowadays for the London economy. And this gets into bigger issues. My God, we need to be building more houses. And so the tax system is only a part of the problem. The lack of building is a bigger one. But this is something we need to sort out.
So that's what you do in terms of tax. But you're saying, I wouldn't get, elected, or I wouldn't get re-elected. But you would have it made the world a better place if we were paying more tax, but life felt better and businesses were growing more and we could employ more people, then we would vote you in. So think about it.
Thank you, Steph.
I mean, look, no, hang on. Let's be clear. What he's talking about is lifting the tax. I can't remember which one has the unfair advantage, cakes or biscuits. But either way, putting taxes up on cake or biscuit, you're never going to be re-elected.
Well, you saw this, and I think we're all old enough to remember Norman Lamont in 1992 or 1993 trying to put VAT on domestic energy. He only got halfway there, despite a really quite generous compensation package for people on low incomes, and so we still only pay 5% VAT. I mean, actually, the Labour government brought that down in 1997. We still only pay 5% VAT on our gas and electricity in a world in which we're supposed to care about climate change. But actually, effectively, we subsidise the consumption of gas because we charge less tax on it than we charge on most other things. But again, it's worth a thought experiment here. Who are the big winners from this in cash terms? It's people who have very big houses, who spend an awful lot of money on heating those houses. If we put VAT on this, we could get easily enough money to more than compensate, on average, most people on lower incomes. But there would always be some people on lower incomes who would lose out. But if we always take the status quo today as the right thing, then we're never going to change. So you can't make any change, or it's very rarely, particularly when incomes aren't rising, without making someone worse off. But why should we be subsidising big users of gas? It just doesn't make any sense at all.
So what about, that's your tax system. What are your fiscal rules then? Give us them.
Again, this is really tough. And I think there's...
But you're loving it. I can see you. Look, you started that last one with...
You're in charge. Listen, you're Chancellor
you're
Chancellor for 3/4 of an hour.
I think so. No set of fiscal rules is perfect, and what we've had over a long period of time is these forward-looking rules, which actually look. I think the current set of fiscal rules, they're broadly sensible. So you can borrow to invest. You've got to get debt down over the medium term. The problem that we're facing is because the Chancellor has decided to set these rules, which are about as loose as they possibly could be, and then going right up against the verge of them, then you kind of have to adjust course every budget. I think the ideal thing would be to have something slightly more qualitative, where you've got, I don't know, whether it's a traffic light system or something from the OBR which says, government says it's going to do this, our assessment is on, I don't know, a scale of 1 to 5, this is, disastrous or this is fiscally sustainable, alongside some more quantitative things. Now, again, maybe that doesn't quite do enough to hold governments to account. But one thing I would say is, we are not in a world in which we can say, look, the problem here is the fiscal rules. They're constraining us from doing things. We could do a pile more stuff if it wasn't for these fiscal rules. We can't. We can't. Our borrowing costs and so on are already absurdly high. So what I'm not going to argue for is any more fiscal looseness than we already have.
It seems to me, though, that there is an argument that says we should take the long-term trend of debt much more seriously and be much less fixated on year-to-year deficits. And my argument would probably be that we should have a simpler rule, which is much more constraining at the overall debt level, but give chancellors rather more flexibility year to year when it comes to the deficit.
Well, I agree. The thing that matters in the end is what's happening to our debt pile. But our debt pile isn't going down. Our debt pile is still rising. And on the definition of debt that we've always previously used, it's rising in right through this Parliament. Now, Rachel Reeves has redefined debt to a measure which is just about beginning to fall towards the end of this Parliament. But the broader picture, and again, referring back to the Office of Budget Responsibilities report last week, is that over the medium term, everything is pushing debt higher. It's nothing. There's nothing helping us. The sort of population aging is pushing it higher. The fact we're going to lose all of our petrol tax revenues is pushing it higher. Lots more spending on defence is pushing it higher. Health spending is pushing it higher. There's nothing pushing in the other direction, and that's why the idea that there's more money that we can spend without raising taxes, I think, is absolutely for the birds.
I mean, I think an interesting question, probably not to be discussed in detail this time, is whether actually having a legally binding debt ceiling like they have in America might be, for a proper democracy like ours, quite a useful constraint.
It's very hard for governments here to do anything that's legally binding, because if you've got a majority, you can always overturn your so-called legally binding
No, but
rule.
if there are annual or biannual votes, it's quite a useful public statement of intent. Anyway, we'll talk about that another time. I did feel, however, given that I revealed my own confusion about the cake biscuit VAT difference, that I would just consult my artificial intelligence friend, and if I can't remember what it is, I suspect there are lots of listeners who can't. So I'm going to reveal the extraordinary irrationality of our approach to cake and biscuits. Apparently, cake, including items like sponge cakes, birthday cakes, and even Jaffa cakes, are 0 rated for VAT. Plain biscuits, digestive shortbreads without chocolate, also 0 rated. But once you've got your chocolate digestive, any biscuit covered in chocolate is classified basically as confectionery, and it's 20%. This is mad, as you say.
Well, I think in gingerbread men, there's no tax. But if you've got more than a couple of chocolate eyes, you've got chocolate buttons on a gingerbread man, then there's tax on that.
This is absolutely... so the question is, if you want to be elected, the Paul Johnson party is the platform that all cakes and biscuits are 0 rated, or is the platform that they've all got to be subject to 20% VAT? Come on, be true to your fiscally responsible self.
20%, absolutely.
20% across the board. Is he going to be elected, Steph?
Yeah, I'm still there for you. I think you.
Yes,
But did you? Hopefully, you're celebrating leaving the IFS with a cake, though, and your colleagues didn't have to pay 20% on it.
Well, look, as always, it's been an absolute treat having you on. I've already told you, in a sense, offline, that even though you're not head of the IFS anymore, we still want you back on the programme in your new sort of academic role at Oxford. So we hope to see you again very soon. But that's it for now from me, Robert Peston.
And from me, Steph McGovern. And Paul, you've got to say it now. And you.
And from me, Paul Johnson. And I will look forward to the invitation back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, cheers, Steph.